Hello and welcome to Verified Live, and we start with the war in Ukraine as Donald Trump continues to ramp up pressure on President Zelensky. The US president has already apparently given him till Christmas to sign up to a deal and accused President Zelensky of using the war to avoid democratic elections. Well, that prompted Ukraine's president to say he is ready for elections if the US and European allies guaranteed security. Well, security guarantees remain one of the key sticking points to any deal, as is Moscow's insistence that Ukraine hands over the whole of the Donbass, even something US negotiators have also been pushing. Well, President Zelensky has said the US-Ukraine talks on the draft document will start later today. But let's start this hour with Donald Trump and his latest salvo about elections in his interview with Politico.
It's been a long time. It hasn't been doing particularly well. Yeah, I think it's time. I think it's an important time to hold an election. You know, they're using war not to hold an election, but I would think the Ukrainian people would, should have that choice, and maybe Zelensky would win. I don't know who would win, but they haven't had an election in a long time. You know, they talk about a democracy, but it gets to a point where it's not a democracy anymore.
Well, that was Donald Trump. Let's talk live on our programme to our correspondents in Kyiv. Joe Gunter is there. In Washington, we have our State Department correspondent, Tom Bateman. And in a moment, we'll speak to Nina Kusheva, Professor of International Affairs at the New York School in New York City. Tom, to you first of all. As I was just saying, President Zelensky saying in the last little while that the US-Ukraine talks on the draft document will start today, and that latest addition from the president talking about free elections in Ukraine. Your analysis of what is happening and where we are?
Well, certainly in terms of conversations, my sense is that what Volodymyr Zelensky is talking about today is about economic reconstruction and post-war planning. That's sort of slightly easier stuff compared with the bigger 20-point framework as it now is, which has been back and forth between Washington, Moscow and Kyiv, with the Europeans being involved as well. Now that I don't think there has been a final sort of transfer of the draft as it is from the Ukrainian side back to the Americans, but I think certainly the Ukrainians are suggesting that will happen very soon. And that is all in the context of this increasing pressure from President Trump onto the Ukrainians. And we heard, you heard a bit of it in that clip you just played from the Politico interview yesterday, that Donald Trump is once again being pretty critical of Volodymyr Zelensky, both directly and in terms of the kind of negotiating positions that are on the table. So the pressure remains on the Ukrainians. My sense from European diplomats is that, I think they feel there has been some progress on the issue of a US security guarantee for Ukraine in the event of a peace deal. I think they feel like they're getting somewhere with the Americans on that. But when it comes to that core issue of territory and the red line for the Ukrainians, saying they will not withdraw from territory that they currently control and just simply hand it over to the Russians in the Donbass as part of an agreement, it doesn't feel like the Ukrainians and the Europeans are getting to a place potentially that they want to on that, and that the Americans are potentially putting their foot down. So that remains an absolutely key and fundamental sticking point. That said, we don't know the exact and precise wording of what is now the redraft that is due to come back from the Ukrainians to the Americans very soon.
Tom, thanks very much for that. Let's head to Kyiv and to Joel. And what are you hearing about the talks, Joel? And also interesting that President Zelensky hasn't ruled out talk about elections, but linking it very definitely to security guarantees.
That is right. Only incremental developments really on this shuttle diplomacy. As you heard a little bit there from Tom, we're hearing from President Zelensky in the last hour or so that they will be talking to US counterparts today about some of these slightly sideline issues of reconstruction and economic development for a post-war Ukraine. The core part of the plan, what we understand now to be a 20-point plan, having been whittled down, is still with the Ukrainians after days of talks between the Ukrainian negotiating team and Trump's envoys in Miami. That is now back here with the Ukrainians, with President Zelensky, to be reviewed, revised, worked on, and we understand that they will be presenting that back to the Americans shortly. As you mentioned, there is this issue of elections, which has come up with President Trump's pressure over the past few days on President Zelensky, saying that Ukraine is, essentially perhaps not even a democracy anymore because of this suspension of elections during the wartime period. President Zelensky said for the first time he is willing to consider having elections, but that he would need the US and the European allies to guarantee security for that process. And talking to Ukrainian MPs today and analysts and people here in Ukraine, they don't really see a way forward to holding a national election, possibly a divisive campaign, and all the security that would be associated with that process before the war ends.
Joel, thanks very much. Well, let's speak live now to Nina Khrushcheva. And Nina, thank you so much for being here on the programme. Apparently, President Zelensky has been given till Christmas by the Trump administration to sign up to this deal. Does it make sense to you to have a deadline like that before you've resolved those key issues about territories, about anything else?
Thank you. Well, this is very Donald Trump. He always says it's just going to be done in 5 minutes, in 24 hours, in 2 months, and so on. So Christmas looks good. Remember, the previous iteration was it has to be done on Thanksgiving Day. Thanksgiving in the United States. So it does make sense from the Trump standpoint because he likes glossy and show-offy stuff. But also Trump himself said, well, if it's going well, then it doesn't necessarily need to be Christmas. So once again, this is not a firm deadline, which I think is obviously better for Ukraine to continue to work on the plan.
A quick question about that election issue. Are you surprised that's now being included? Because when you look at Russia, for example, they haven't had free and fair elections for decades under Putin. And this has always been one of Moscow's demands to have elections in Ukraine.
Well, and that's sort of an interesting thing about the kind of Russian apparatus and Russian propaganda. In fact, you may remember that just a few days back, Putin himself said, well, we are at war too, which is, of course, very different war in Russia and Ukraine because Russia is attacking Ukraine, that we did have elections, never mind. So for Putin, elections is a performance, and they certainly do the performance very well. And so for them, the way he sees Russia, that's good enough. In Ukraine, it is a real thing, or was a real thing, and therefore, of course, it needs preparation. It needs actual voters and an actual process, and I think that makes it difficult. I'm not surprised that Vladimir Zelensky said that he'd do it. I'm not surprised that Trump has been pushing for it because it's not the first time he said, where is your elections? And not surprised by Zelensky's response because it is a negotiation tactic in a sense. America, you want elections, you're going to have it, but you have to provide security.
Of course, the worry also would be Russia undermining those elections to back some sort of stooge candidate. A quick thought on Donald Trump. His son was saying only a couple of days ago that he thought that the US president was prepared to walk away from these peace talks if there wasn't success. Do you think that is likely?
Absolutely. I think Donald Trump has been trying to get out of it right from the beginning. I mean, if it weren't peace in 24 hours, then every single step that Trump has made is to really make himself less involved. We know that he keeps reminding everybody that American taxpayers are not paying for the assistance of Ukraine. That's the Europeans are buying weapons. It's so America is only making money on that. So yes, I think he is willing, and I would imagine by the end of next year, if it's not resolved, he probably would either completely withdraw from the process or would be very close to it.
A final thought, because the president has been taking pot shots at Europe, both in the new national security document, also in interviews where he's talking about the EU being decaying with weak leaders. Do you think we are on the brink of a fundamental rupture of the transatlantic alliance?
Well, I think it's a question for Europe. It's really not a question for me. But we do know that Trump does not consider Ukraine war his war. He keeps reminding us that that's the case. He keeps sort of thinking of Vladimir Zelensky as a Joe Biden's boy in a sense. He wants to get out of it. He's obsessed and needs to be Venezuela, Asia, China, whatever. Putin is not his enemy. And if Europe thinks that Putin is the enemy and Europe wants to be in this war, so then the way he thinks it, all power to them. And the final sort of the national security strategy that just came out basically moves America out of leadership of NATO. So it is possible that Trump doesn't want to be part of that anymore. And I even have a prediction, not a prediction, but sort of thinking scenario. If Trump is no longer president and say J.D. Vance, the vice president, is now, then that relationship is certainly going to be severed because J.D. Vance does see Europe as an opposition to the United States. So not maybe with Trump, but if Vance is the next president, that's probably going to happen.
Professor, always great to talk to you. Thanks for joining us live here on BBC News.